Hello friends, glad to see you on the channel again. Today we have a very interesting topic. We will remember those very muscle cars from the 80s, which in reality turned out to be a complete disappointment. Yes, it sounds loud, but at that time, car manufacturers tried to return to the former glory of the 60s and 70s and ended up releasing cars that looked more menacing in pictures than in real life. These cars promised power and drive, but in fact they turned out to be slow, heavy, and often fragile. Many owners later complained that their dream turned into a nightmare, and these are the examples we will analyze today. So get comfortable. Today I will tell you about 7 absolutely useless muscle cars from the 80s, which in 2025 are definitely not worth spending money on. Perhaps some models will surprise you, and some will even touch a sore spot. But this is what makes our conversation interesting. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell. I have many more stories about strange, failed, and forgotten cars ahead, and you definitely won't want to miss it. Well, let's start with the first car, the 1980 Chevrolet Camaro Berlinetta. On paper, it seemed like a continuation of the iconic Camaro line, but in reality, it's one of the strangest and most unnecessary modifications to the Chevrolet. The Berlinetta was intended as a more luxurious version of the Camaro, aimed not at speed lovers, but at those who wanted a little more comfort and glitz. But in the end, the car satisfied neither category of buyers. For muscle car lovers, it was too slow. For those who craved luxury, it was too cheap and noisy. Under the hood was a base V6 engine that produced only about 110 horsepower. For a car that looked like a sports coupe, it was a complete failure. Even the V8 version didn't save the situation. 155 horsepower in the early 80s sounded ridiculous, especially against the background of the fact that in the 70s, the Camaro easily exceeded 250 to 300. Owners often complained that the Berlinetta looked like it was about to break away, but in fact it was inferior to even the most ordinary sedans. The interior is a separate story. Chevrolet tried to play on the premium, adding more soft trim and luxury panels, but the owners said that it all looked cheap, wore out quickly, and creaked after a couple of years. One of the reviews in an old car magazine of that time sounded like this: "It looks like a party car but feels like cheap furniture on wheels." And the most interesting thing is that the Berlinetta was not even a cheap version of the Camaro. It cost more than the base model but was worse in almost every way. Worse handling, worse performance, and only slightly more comfort options. Essentially, Chevrolet was selling a pretty shell devoid of substance. The Berlinetta ultimately became a symbol of how manufacturers in the early 80s tried to save their models, but did so through cosmetic and marketing changes rather than real improvements. The 1980 Camaro Berlinetta is an example of a car that tried to please everyone, but ended up pleasing no one. It's no wonder that almost no one remembers it today, except as a strange mistake in the history of the Camaro. Moving on to the second car, the 1982 Pontiac Firebird. It could have created a legendary name, an iconic design, and started a new era for the model. But in reality, it is one of the weakest and most controversial versions of the Firebird in its entire history. Let's start with the main thing: power. When people hear Firebird, they imagine a brutal engine, a roaring V8, and basic power. But in 1982, everything happened differently. The base version was equipped with a 4-cylinder engine with 90 horsepower. Yes, 90. For a car that looked like a sports car and was associated with wild power, this was almost humiliating. Even more expensive versions with a V6 or V8 suffered from strict emission standards, and as a result, the maximum power barely reached 165 horsepower. For comparison, the old Firebirds of the late 60s could produce twice as much. Owners of that time often complained that the car looked much faster than it actually went. Many wrote in reviews that at traffic lights, the Firebird was inferior even to the most ordinary sedans like the Toyota Camry or Honda Accord. Imagine, you get into the icon of the muscular president and overtake family cars from Japan. The second point is the build quality. The interior looked futuristic, with digital instruments and an unusual panel design, but all this quickly broke down. The buttons jammed, the instruments blinked, the plastic creaked already in the second year of operation. One of the owners later said, "The '82 Firebird looked like a car of the future, but felt like a car from a cheap supermarket." Of course, it must be admitted, the design was bold. Many still consider the third generation of the Firebird one of the most beautiful. But the problem is that under this shell was a car that did not live up to its promises at all. Another funny thing, the 1982 Firebird was made famous in large part by the Knight Rider series, where KITT was this model. But the irony is that on screen, viewers were shown a supercar with artificial intelligence and crazy capabilities, while in reality, the same car turned out to be slow, fragile, and disappointing. Ultimately, the 1982 Firebird went down in history not as a triumph, but as an example of how an unforgettable design and a big name could not hide a weak engine, mediocre quality, and failure to meet expectations. It was a beautiful facade, devoid of real power. The next third car on our list is the 1980 AMC Spirit AMX. And frankly, this is an example of how the company was desperately trying to stay in the muscle car market when this era itself was already becoming a thing of the past. The AMX name has always been associated with a sporty spirit, with the spirit of speed and drive. But in the case of the Spirit AMX, everything turned out to be the opposite. In fact, it was a small, compact car, more like a hatchback than a real muscle car. And although AMC tried to sell it as a sports car, in reality, many people got the impression that it was just an ordinary subcompact with stickers and body kits. The main problem, of course, was under the hood. The base versions of the Spirit AMX received a modest 4-cylinder engine with a capacity of 80 to 90 horsepower. Even with the optional 6-cylinder engine, the dynamics were far from sporty. Yes, there was a 304 cubic inch V8 option, but even that only produced about 125 to 130 horsepower. For 1980, when competitors like the Camaro and Mustang II weren't exactly shining, that was still tolerable, but calling that kind of power AMX sounded like a travesty. Owners recalled that acceleration was sluggish and handling was mediocre. One former owner wrote, "It looked sporty, but the Spirit behaved like any cheap compact car. You expect emotion from it, but the ride is boring." The build quality also left much to be desired. AMC was already experiencing serious financial difficulties, and it showed. The interior looked cheap, the plastic quickly cracked, and the body was covered with corrosion after just a few winters. Another problem was the noise. At speeds above 80 kilometers per hour, the interior resembled a tin can in which everything possible rattled. Interestingly, AMC positioned the Spirit AMX as a youthful, sporty, and affordable car. But the reality turned out to be different. Young buyers, thirsty for dynamism, were disappointed in its dynamics, and those who wanted an economical car chose Japanese models such as Datsun or Toyota, since they were more reliable and comfortable. As a result, the Spirit AMX became a symbol of how the name AMX, which once sounded proud and sporty, turned into an empty shell. The car looked playful, had stripes, badges, and style, but had neither the power nor the character to justify its ambitions. Today, this model is perceived rather as a rarity. It is difficult to find on the road. But frankly, collectors do not value it because despite the big name, there is no real success story behind it. The The Spirit AMX was a car that promised to be sporty, but in reality turned out to be just a modest subcompact with a powerful engine. Now let's talk about a car that is often forgotten, but it had a chance to become something more. Number 4. 1981 Mercury Capri RS. Capri was originally positioned as a European Mustang. In the 70s, this name was used for copies of Ford Capri, which left Europe. But by the beginning of the 80s, Mercury decided, why carry when you can just give a slightly modified Mustang body and sell it as a Capri? In fact, it was a twin brother of Mustang, only with different headlights and badges. In the RS version, Mercury, I think, to give the car a sporty lifestyle. It has stripes, an aggressive appearance, and even a claim to a sporty character. But the reality turned out to be much more prosaic. The main problem is the engine. In the base, Capri RS 1981 received a 4-cylinder engine with 88 horsepower. Yes, it sounds wild, a sports RS with such an engine. Acceleration to 60 miles per hour took almost 14 seconds, and they recalled that any Japanese compact car could beat them on the highway. One driver wrote, "I had a Capri RS, and the sportiest thing about it was the stickers. At the traffic lights, a Toyota Corolla would easily follow me from behind. Optionally, you could install a V6 or even a V8, but then the main drawback migrated to the car: weight. Capri with the specified engines became heavy and uncontrollable, and the power of the V8 in the early 80s was severely stifled by environmental standards, about 130 to 140 horsepower max. For a car with such an image, this sounded frankly weak. Assembly production is also a separate story. An owner from the forum recalled, "The dashboard creaked as if I was riding a cart. The body began to rust after a couple of years, even though I looked after the car." And this was not the only case. Mercury suffered from the same problems as Ford in those years: cheap materials, flimsy interior, and poor protection from the gearbox. On the road, the Capri RS behaved, to put it mildly, strangely. The suspension was either too stiff or too loose in control, depending on the configuration, and the steering suffered from a cottony feeling. People who expected precision are disappointed. And the most interesting thing, Capri RS was advertised as an affordable alternative to Mustang for those who wanted to stand out. But in reality, buyers were equal. It was easier to take a Mustang. At least it had a name, recognition, and a little more respect on the street. Capri looks the same as its cheap copy, although it is sold under the premium Mercury brand. Today, the 1981 Capri is rarely remembered. The car did not become a cult, did not receive the status of a collector. And if the Mustang of those years can still be found at an exhibition, then the Capri most often disappears without a trace. As a result, this car was only assembled in a way that marketing tried to pass off an ordinary, mediocre purchase as a sporty RS. The Capri RS is the case when the RS sticker promised drive, but behind the wheel you got only a modest engine, mediocre quality, and the feeling that you were simply deceived by a loud name. Number 5. 1984 Grand Prix 2+2. Pontiac made this car for NASCAR. The thing is, in the early 80s, the Chevrolet Monte Carlo Era Coupe and Ford Thunderbird dominated the tracks with their streamlined bodies. To somehow compete, Pontiac decided to make its own aerodynamic version of the Grand Prix. And so the 2+2 appeared, a rare version with an elongated nose and a strange bubble rear window. In appearance, he really preferred it. The front end was narrowed to reduce drag, the rear window was strongly inclined, and the trunk lid made a small tail. All this was necessary not for beauty, but so that Pontiac could register the car in NASCAR according to homologation rules. But the problem began where it came to buyers. Only about 1,200 were built, which was practically mandatory for NASCAR to allow the car to race. However, it was a total failure for the average driver. There was nothing revolutionary under the hood. The car had a 165 horsepower 305 V8, which was as sluggish as the standard models. Acceleration was dismal, about 11 seconds to 60 miles per hour, and the owner joked that the aerodynamics were only there to make the car go downhill faster. One wrote, "It looked like I had a NASCAR Pontiac, but it didn't drive as well as my old Buick Regal." The interior was also a disappointment. The interior was typical of the 80s, boring panels, cheap plastic, uncomfortable seats. People expected something special for the rarity of the model, but instead it was a regular Grand Prix interior. Another problem was the design. In real life, the 2+2 looked odd, to say the least. The front of the car did look sporty, but the back with that round window raised questions for many. One owner said, "Everyone asked me why my car looked like a cross between a sedan and an aquarium." The result was a car that was supposed to be collectible and sporty, but in fact turned out to be a useless compromise. It wasn't fast, it wasn't comfortable, and it handled controversially. And while it served its purpose in NASCAR, in real life, the 2+2 is considered one of the strangest and most pointless Pontiacs of the era. Today, it's remembered by fans of their favorite 80s cars. But for most car enthusiasts, the 1984 Pontiac Grand Prix 2+2 is remembered as a car that promised NASCAR speed and aerodynamics, but in reality was just another slow, awkwardly built coupe. Number 6, 1987 Oldsmobile 442. When you hear the name 442, you immediately imagine the classic muscle cars of the 60s. A huge V8, a crazy exhaust note, smoke from the tires, and great power under the hood. But in 1987, the situation looked completely different. Oldsmobile seemed to be thinking about reviving its iconic name, but did so unconvincingly that many fans still call this car the final nail in the 442's coffin. So what's wrong with this? Let's start with the engine. Under the hood was a 307th V8 with a carburetor, which produced a measly 170 horsepower. And this at a time when competitors like the Buick Grand National were already giving out 245 horses with a turbo. The 442 accelerated to 60 miles per hour in almost 9 seconds, which, as owners joked, was faster than walking, but only if you were running uphill. I remember one review. It looked like a sports car, but it ran like an old man. The body is actually a Cutlass Supreme with decals and a slightly more aggressive look. Yes, there was a black grille, there were graphic stripes, but if you remove the decals, it was a regular Cutlass coupe. Many buyers regretted that the 442 was decorated in a more packaged design than the actual sports version. The interior didn't help the situation either. It was filled with typical 80s GM plastic, square gauges, and heavy seats. Owners noted that the interior creaked and wore out. One Oldsmobile fan later wrote, "I bought the 442 for the name, but every time I drove it, I realized it was just a Cutlass in a tracksuit." Of course, the car wasn't completely terrible. It handled well for the time, and the suspension was a little stiffer than the standard models. But the problem was that the 442 was expected to be a muscle car, and what it got was a car that was more suited to a leisurely drive around the country than a track day. As a result, the 1987 Oldsmobile 442 became a symbol of how American muscle cars lost their soul in the 1980s. The name was still loud, but the content was no longer indicated. And that's why many today consider it one of the most disappointing muscle cars of the 1980s. He went down in history not as a hero, but as a sad reminder that even the most ancient models can turn into ordinary cars if there is no real power behind the big name. When you look at the number 7, 1985 Buick Regal T-Type, the first thing that comes to mind is that's an 80s classic. At the time, GM was trying to turn the regular Regal into a proper sports sedan, and the T-Type was an attempt to make it hot. On paper, everything looked good. A turbocharged V6, rear-wheel drive, and a flashy, sporty interior. But let's be honest, what looks cool on paper turned out to be the complete opposite in practice. For starters, the 3.8-liter turbocharged V6 wasn't all that reliable. Turbocharging was still a new thing for mass-market cars, and Buick's engineers clearly underestimated the complexity of the technology. The cars often overheated, the turbo failed, and replacing these parts was expensive and painful. In short, if you buy a Regal like this today, be prepared for the engine to require serious attention, to say the least. And the handling wasn't great either. Buick marketed the T-Type as a driver's sedan, but in reality it was a heavy, sluggish car. The suspension was soft, the steering was sluggish, and when entering a turn the Regal seemed to float. Yes, it was no Ferrari, of course, but for the 80s, expectations were higher than reality. Another problem was the brakes. They were too soft for the turbocharged engine, so sharp braking turned into a real test of the driver's nerves. In the interior, Buick tried to play on luxury. Red leather, a sports steering wheel, a beautiful dashboard, it looks impressive. But the build quality left much to be desired. Plastic cracks easily, buttons and knobs loosen over time, and the air conditioner can simply fail in the heat. And frankly, after 35 to 40 years, most of these cars look outdated, despite all the design tricks. So why did this Regal T-Type end up on the useless list? Not because it was ugly or boring, but because it was too ambitious for its time. Turbocharged engines, sporty trim, rear-wheel drive. It all sounds cool, but the car was fragile, temperamental, and expensive to maintain. Today, it has almost no collectible value, and its upkeep is hugely time-consuming and expensive. So if you see a 1985 Buick Regal T-Type on the street, don't be fooled by its appearance. Yes, it screams 80s sports car, but underneath that flashy exterior is a heavy, unreliable, and impractical machine. It's one of those cars that looks impressive in photos, but is more trouble than it's worth in real life. My advice? Look at it as a monument to its era, but definitely not worth investing in 2025.